The night had an unsettling stillness, as though the forest itself held its breath. Ada stood at the edge of the dense foliage, clutching a lantern, its flickering flame the only source of light. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Never go near the whispering woods after dark. The spirits there are older than time, and they hunger for the living." But Ada had no choice. Her younger brother, Chaik, had wandered into the forest hours ago chasing after their goat, and he hadn't returned. "Chaik!" Ada called, her voice trembling as she stepped deeper into the forest. The lantern's glow danced on the gnarled tree trunks, casting eerie, shifting shadows. As she walked, the air grew colder, and the silence was broken by a low, murmuring sound. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the rustling of leaves. It was faint, indistinct, like voices whispering just out of reach. "Chaik?" Ada called again, her voice quivering. The whispers grew louder, but they didn't sound human. They sounded ancient, layered, as though dozens of voices spoke at once. Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled with the matches in her pocket, her hands shaking. The whispers surrounded her now, rising into a sinister chorus. "Ada!" She froze. The voice her name was unmistakable, but it wasn't Chaik's voice. It was deep, guttural, and reverberated through the woods like a growl. "Who's there?" Ada demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadows seemed to shift, coiling around her. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, or at least something that looked like one. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He grinned, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Now, you'll never leave." Ada turned and ran, the whispers chasing her, growing louder and more chaotic. Her feet stumbled over roots and rocks as she fled blindly through the dark forest. Suddenly, she tripped and fell, the impact knocking the wind out of her. As she scrambled to her feet, she realized she was no longer alone. A ring of figures surrounded her, their faces obscured by shadows. Each one whispered, their words unintelligible yet filled with menace. The lantern's flame reignited on its own, casting a dim light. Ada's breath caught in her throat as she recognized one of the figures. It was Chaik, but his eyes glowed yellow, just like the man's, and his face twisted into an unnatural grin. "Ada," he said, his voice layered with the same guttural whispers, "you shouldn't have come." Ada staggered backward, her mind reeling. The boy standing before her looked like Cheek, but she knew it wasn't him. His grin stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes bore into her with an unnatural intensity. "Chaik, what have they done to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Chaik, or whatever, had taken his form, tilted his head, his grin fading into a cold stare. "You've brought yourself here, sister. The forest feeds on fear, and you are ripe." The other shadowy figures stepped closer, their whispers growing louder. Ada gripped the lantern tightly, her knuckles white. Desperation clawed at her chest as she glanced around, searching for a way out. "Let him go," she shouted, her voice echoing through the forest. "Take me instead." A chilling laugh echoed from the shadows, and the man with the glowing yellow eyes emerged once more. "Brave words," he sneered, his voice a cruel melody. "But the forest doesn't bargain, it consumes." Before she could react, the lantern flickered again, and the flame erupted into an eerie blue light. The shadows recoiled momentarily, giving Ada a fleeting moment of clarity. She remembered her grandmother's tales of the Forstoff, how fire and light were the only things that could hold back the spirits. With renewed determination, Ada raised the lantern and stepped forward, the blue flame casting long, wavering beams into the darkness. The figures hissed and retreated, their forms melting into the shadows. Only Chaik remained, standing eerily still. "Chaik, listen to me," Ada pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Fight them! You are stronger than this!" For a moment, his glowing eyes flickered and his expression softened. But then, the man's guttural voice cut through the air. "Enough!" He raised his hand, and the forest seemed to shudder. The ground beneath Ada's feet began to quake, roots erupting from the soil to ensnare her ankles. Ada struggled, the lantern slipping from her grasp and landing with a thud. The blue flame sputtered, threatening to go out. The man approached, his grin returning. "You are brave, child, but bravery will not save you. The forest has chosen. As the roots tightened around her, Ada closed her eyes, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. The forest is alive, but it fears one thing: truth. Speak it, and you may find a way out. Taking a deep breath, Ada screamed at the top of her lungs, "This forest is cursed because of you!" Her voice cut through the whispers like a blade. "You trapped the innocent, but your power is stolen. You are nothing but a parasite." The man's grin faltered, and the shadows writhed violently. "Lies!" he roared, but his voice wavered. Ada continued, her voice steady despite her fear. "You were cast out, weren't you? A spirit rejected by the gods. This forest is your prison." The lantern's blue flame flared brightly, illuminating the forest in an unnatural glow. The figures screamed and began to dissolve into mist. The man staggered backward, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. "This is far from over. The forest will always hunger." With a final roar, he and the remaining shadows vanished, leaving the forest eerily silent. The roots around Ada's ankles withered, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. "Chike," she whispered, crawling toward the spot where he had stood. The forest was empty, save for the faint sound of rustling leaves. Tears filled her eyes as she picked up the lantern, its blue flame now a steady, comforting light. "Chike," she sobbed, "I'll find you, I promise." Ada staggered through the forest, clutching the lantern, its blue flame a fragile lifeline against the darkness. Though the sinister figures had vanished, the forest remained alive with an oppressive energy. Every shadow seemed to watch her, every rustling leaf a whispered threat. The silence was unbearable, broken only by Ada's labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But then, faintly, she heard Eta Charles' laughter. "Chike!" she called, her voice trembling. The laughter came again, distant but clear. It echoed through the trees, pulling her forward. She followed the sound, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. As she pushed deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and a heavy fog began to roll in. The laughter grew louder, more distinct, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't joyous, it was sharp, mocking. Ada stopped abruptly. Ahead of her, the fog parted to reveal a clearing bathed in an otherworldly light. In the center stood a massive ancient tree, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree was a large hollow, its darkness pulsating like a heartbeat. From the hollow, the laughter echoed again. This time, it was joined by faint cries and whispers, a chorus of voices overlapping in a chilling symphony. Ada gripped the lantern tighter. "Chike, are you there?" The whispers ceased. For a moment, the forest was deathly silent. Then, from the hollow, a voice called out, "Ada, help me!" It was Chike. Without hesitation, Ada stepped into the clearing, her eyes fixed on the hollow. The ground beneath her feet felt strange, soft and spongy, as though the earth itself recoiled from her touch. "Chike, I am coming," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. But as she approached the tree, the lantern's flame flickered violently, and a deep guttural growl rumbled from the hollow. The ground trembled, and the whispers returned, louder and more frenzied. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the hollow, grabbing her ankle. It was small and pale Chike's hand. "Ada!" he screamed, his face appearing in the darkness. His eyes were wide with terror, his cheeks streaked with tears. "Help me! It's pulling me in!" Ada dropped to her knees, grabbing his arm. "Hold on! I've got you!" But as she pulled, the shadows in the hollow writhed and surged, forming a massive, grotesque face. Its hollow eyes glowed with malice, and its mouth twisted into a sinister grin. "Release him," it hissed, its voice rattling through Ada's skull. "He belongs to us now." "Never!" Ada screamed, yanking Chike with all her strength. The lantern flared again, its blue light burning brighter. The shadowy face recoiled, screeching in agony. Chike's hand slipped free from the shadow's grip, and Ada pulled him into her arms. The hollow erupted with a deafening roar, and the tree began to shudder. "Run!" Ada shouted, dragging Chike to his feet. Together they bolted from the clearing, the whispers chasing after them like a swarm of angry bees. As they ran, the forest seemed to shift and twist, the trees closing in around them, but the lantern's light cut through the darkness, guiding their path. Finally, they burst out of the forest and onto the familiar path leading back to their village. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the oppressive weight lifted. Ada collapsed to the ground, clutching Chaik tightly. He was trembling, his face pale, but he was alive. "Are you okay?" she asked, brushing his hair from his face. Chaik nodded weakly. I thought I'd never get out. It was like a nightmare that wouldn't end." Ada held him close, tears streaming down her face. "It's over now. You are safe." But as they sat there, catching their breath, Ada couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching them, its hunger far from satisfied.